Welcome everyone to the China-US Women's Foundation weekly Zoom session. Today we're so happy to have Kyung B, Yoon, who is president and co-founder of the Korean American Community Foundation, KACF, a leading funder of Korean and Asian American community organizations in the greater New York City area, and a model of inclusive and participatory philanthropy in immigrant communities. Kyung is currently a contributing reporter to CUNY TV's Asian American Life, which is broadcasting nationally on PBS stations, and for which she received an Emmy nomination in 2015. She serves on the board chair of Philanthropy New York and as a trustee of New York Foundation. She is the immediate past board chair of Asian American Pacific Islanders in Philanthropy and a former board member of the United Way of New York City. So welcome, Kyung. Thank you so much for joining us today. Just a couple comments about why I am so pleased. First of all, Kyung is a classmate of mine from Wellesley College, so we truly are old dear friends. She also is a bit of a role model for me in that she really boldly started her foundation with the eye of involving Korean Americans in the dialogue and empowering them, because actually a lot of them are living in poverty. And so Kyung gave a voice to a lot of people and has generated a lot of community involvement before it was cool. Now she has stepped up and is a thought leader in dealing with AAPI, violence and racism. But she was really working very hard throughout for years to try and give voice to people. So thank you, Kyung, for that. Why the Women's Foundation is so interested in the whole subject is that this summer we are going to be hosting again our second summer program focused on building community. To do that, there are going to be two main projects. One will be trying to rebuild the women's community after the She Session. So we're going to be talking to business leaders about what their companies can do to solve this problem. And then we're also going to be showcasing Chinese American artists in order to create a bigger sense of community in America and understanding. And we're fortunate to have Marian Bernstein, a member of our leadership team, who is going to be helping us as we develop this program. So stay tuned for that. So Kyung, in light of all the exciting things that are happening, tell us a little bit about yourself. You were born in Korea and you came to America for your education. What was that like?
Yeah, thank you very much, Leslie. And it's really terrific to be here with you, to see many of you, and also especially Dana, to see you again as
Nice to
another
meet you too.
participant. Yeah. Um, so, I was born in Seoul, Korea. I came to America actually at a very young age. I was 6 years old, just mainly following my parents around because my father was in the foreign service for Korea. So we weren't really immigrants, and we weren't like, I didn't come to America thinking this was going to become my home, which it has. But I grew up all my life, starting at the age of 6, outside of Korea. And so, on one level, it sounds like a very exotic childhood that I lived in Washington, D.C., and then also lived in Paris, France, and and learned many languages. But of course, when you're like 10 years old, and you just made some friends, the worst thing is like you get uprooted and have to move again to another country and learn a new language and new cultural norms. And yet, when I look back, I feel like even more than any formal education that I had, that actually that informal education that made me stretch, that made me have to figure things out, that made me, get out of my comfort zone was probably the best kind of preparation in many ways for life. And so, I will say that my father's career took us around, with like 3-year stints for about 10 years. So from before being like 6 or 7 years old to being like 17 when my parents went back to Korea, I was on, they left me here. They left me in America so that because, I could have opportunities to go to college in America. And I, was really blessed to be able to go to Wellesley College and to be able to also find an environment where I was able to think about, furthering not only education in terms of, knowledge, but in terms of identity, certainly as a woman, as a feminist, but also as a Korean American, as an Asian American, and what did that look like? And I think that really has led me to my current work around leading the Korean American community, um, which in many ways, just like America or New York, is very complicated. We are very, there's a lot of disparities. So there are people who are really, really doing well, just like in any community. And then there are many people who are really struggling. And I think COVID really, lifted the veil on that. So what I found has been so valuable in my community foundation's work is that we are actually able to empower our community to be philanthropic, and those who have the desire and the capacity and the headspace, to be giving back, that we are able to direct those funds to where there are the greatest needs and where their funding will have the greatest impact. So it's been really incredibly meaningful for me, and also we've very, very timely work as we are kind of thinking about a lot of things that narratives around what it means to be American at this time of racial reckoning for this country, and also where we are sort of seeing, where conversations around race, and often it can be framed as being very black and white, but as Korean and as Asian Americans, how we insert ourselves and where and how we can be added. So.
So, how did you come to start the foundation? I know you had a very successful, interesting career in journalism and reporting. You have a background in international relations. What inspired you to start the foundation?
So just going back, I would at Wellesley, I was an English major. Like I loved, like I loved reading and writing, and but I realized that I'm not gonna probably. I had to be a little practical as I thought about graduating and whether I could make a living, reading Jane Austen novels. And so I actually after Wellesley, I went. I did a master's in development economics, which was also interesting to me because as a Korean, in my lifetime, I was seeing, even though I was not living in Korea, alongside, I was seeing like the incredible transformation and economic development of my own country, and it was really exciting, and I wanted to understand like why do some countries or communities, are they able to make um, that transformation, evolution, and what are the ingredients for that versus the ones that don't? And so I studied economic development at Johns Hopkins at SAIS, at the School of Advanced International Studies after Wellesley. And my first job actually was at the World Bank, where I worked on economic development issues. But there was that English major in me still, a lot of deeply embedded. And you remember, at the time, like a very iconic figure in America, and the only really visible Asian American journalist was Connie Chung. And I remember kind of going like, whoa, like that would be interesting. And and I think that is the importance of having visibility and role models. I mean, she really inspired me to kind of think, well, maybe I could do that too, And so I decided to make a career change. Um, after working at the World Bank, like to a totally different field, and that was broadcast journalism. And that brought me to New York in the 80s, and where I was really fortunate to get my foot in the door at a local television station here, Channel 5. I became the first Korean American broadcast reporter in New York, and so it was kind of a funny thing, right? Where I was like I was well known to the Korean American community because like I was on the news every night. And then also my name, Kyung Yoon, like it's very Korean. So there was a lot of pride, in my community for my visibility and voice. But I actually didn't know the New York Korean community at all. Like, I mean, having just come here to pursue my sort of individual dream, which many of us do, right? And so, but for many years, I was pursuing, my career as a broadcast journalist, and then actually wound up getting this amazing opportunity to go back to the World Bank several years later. And this time, this is like in the mid 90s, to be the executive producer of television for the World Bank Institute, which is the educational arm of the bank, where I developed and hosted a global television documentary series looking at stories in poverty to better ways of life around the world. And so that was kind of a really dream job that married both of my interests and then also my storytelling. And I often say that to some of, to young women and to people who are kind of thinking about career and career journeys, that, it's really important, I think, to kind of listen to what makes you makes your heart sing. I mean, but of course with a dose of practicality. But I didn't know that there was a job like what that World Bank job did not exist, when I graduated from college, and just in the same way that so many jobs today didn't exist, like 20 years ago or whatever. So rather than trying to prepare yourself to fit into something, it's really so important, I think, to prepare yourself for what like for missional work, like what really, like what is the difference you want to make in the world, but also like being aligning with where are your talents and expertise and what you're building up. I found when I was my first job at the World Bank, where I was like crunching a lot of numbers, doing economic analysis, I really didn't like it, and it was not a good fit for me. And I, I could, I, I was competent, but it was always like, I really like did not look forward to Mondays and, whatever. And it's not to say that we all have to have jobs where we're all like flying out of bed on Monday mornings, can't wait to go. I mean, we got to be realistic. But when I started in in the newsroom in journalism, like I just felt like instead of swimming, against the current, I was swimming with it, like so that I could work just as hard, but I was going much further. I was really like, it was like going with me. And then certainly when I went back to the World Bank, I saw what a difference it was to be in the right job and with the right skill sets and things like that. So that was a lesson. I think for me then, even though I was working and traveling and also having a family, I always made time for volunteerism. And for me, that had a lot to do with Asian American community. Um, and so I actually was served for many years on the board, and I was the chair of the board of what was then the New York Asian Women's Center. It's now today called Womankind, and it's a wonderful organization that helps battered women and children in New York's Asian communities. And that experience and working alongside the executive director really taught me that one of the biggest gaps that grassroots organizations face, it's not about being able to deliver services. It's really about always not being able to fundraise and the funding gaps. And also that a lot of these organizations that are doing really necessary and powerful work are absolutely invisible to funders, to like, especially to like large foundations and where the money is. and also the needs of a community like the Asian American community because of prevailing stereotypes. We are the model minority. That means that we're all successful, but they're, you know, like it leads to uh, an erasure of what I said. Like, so people are just seeing, you know, when I said that there's like wealth disparities. So you have, you know, very people are doing really well, and then lots of, you know, poverty. Um, you know, I don't know if you guys know, but according to the New York City Mayor's office and lots of data, Asian Americans in New York are the largest poverty group of any racial or ethnic group, and people don't know that. And so this is, and the fact that, you know, that we don't know that, it just is something that we're not going to get resources for. That's what led me to help start this philanthropy in my community, in the Korean American community, together with a number of other Korean Americans who we were all doing, you know, pretty well. Like because we had a chance to go to college here, you know, thanks to sacrifices of others, and you know, we didn't have barriers of language and inclusion that many immigrants and people of color face. Um, and yet we weren't like Bill Gates or anything like that. We could just start a foundation. So we started with just a, you know, like a slogan that was $1 a day for our neighbors. And so we're talking, you know, like $1, you know, it's less than a cup of coffee, right? Like to put it aside to give to our community. And so we had, and I remember in those days, and oh, and this was in the fall of 2002. So we're talking like almost 20 years ago. We started with that slogan, and just we would have loved if like some Korean version of Bill Gates showed up and said like, we would like to see this foundation and give you $365,000 to start this foundation. But we thought like, if we can get 1,000 of us to do the $1 a day, that's the same, and it's much more sustainable and more powerful. And so we've grown way beyond that. I mean, in our first year in 2003, we raised by giving ourselves and by asking our friends and family, we raised $60,000 that first year that we gave out to 5 community-based organizations, about $12,000 each. And we were very proud of that. Last year, we gave KACF, Korean American Community Foundation, we gave more than $1 million in grants. And cumulatively, so I mean, we did 60,000 the first year, and maybe 80,000 the second year, and 100, you know, but cumulatively this year we will be surpassing $10 million in grants, and we are the largest funder of Asian American nonprofits in the greater New York, New Jersey area. And so there's been a lot of learnings there because, you know, I just talked about Bill Gates, but I mean, sometimes when people say like the word philanthropy, the image, and we internalize it too, but the image is a philanthropist is somebody, you know, usually white and male and like who doesn't look like us. But we needed to really think about, you know, reshaping like our idea of who is a philanthropist. You can, and you know, you can be $1 a day giver, and you're giving, and you're a philanthropist, and there's power in that and importance. And we are really proud, you know, to be heading into our 20th year and to be able to, at a time, especially like the pandemic last year, it really showed the importance of grassroots sort of knowledge and community, and that oftentimes, you know, people will go to for help even to places where you speak the language, where you have where they feel they belong, and those kinds of things we were able to really facilitate.
So tell us a little bit about, you know, it can be your experience, but also the foundation's experience. You know, it's been incredible, let's face it, you know, the pandemic, uh, the pressure of a Trump administration, which was really creating a very toxic environment for Asian Americans. Um, what did you think to do in terms of um, directing your foundation in order to kind of counter all of these trends?
Well, I think one thing that's really important to recognize is that in the surge of, anti-Asian sentiments and violence that really rose, during the pandemic, and it certainly was, fuel on the flames when you have, like leaders who are scapegoating a certain uh, race or a certain ethnicity, right? And calling it Kung flu and China virus. And then, it's like it is really irresponsible. But beyond that, it actually wasn't surprising in many ways because this is not something that started with COVID, the anti-Asian discrimination in America. And it's not something that will be ending with this pandemic. It is deeply rooted in American history. I mean, I remember when the Muslim ban came into, when Trump started the Muslim ban, and people were saying that's not America. Like we don't, that is, this is terrible. But the reality is that it, that the Chinese were the first to be subjected to an exclusion act by America, in America, by a policy signed by a president, in 1882 to be excluded on the base of race. And just America is replete with many, many examples of scapegoating Asian Americans, when it's convenient to do so. During World War II, when Japanese Americans of Japanese descent were put into concentration camps in this country. I mean, I think it's a very, very important to remember that and to know that. I think the kind of in 1982, the murder of Vincent Chin, a young Chinese American man in Detroit, at a time when the auto industry in America was reeling because of Japanese exports that were much more um, fuel efficient and frankly better cars. And because of the sort of anti-Japanese sentiments, these two auto workers in Detroit murdered Vincent Chin, a Chinese American who had nothing to do with the Japanese auto industry. He was about to get married and he was out for his bachelor party and he was beaten to death with a baseball bat. And not only that, but the two men who killed Vincent Chin were never spent a day in jail. I mean, they paid a $3,000 fine and never spent a day in jail. And I think that tragedy, but for the first time really galvanized a pan-Asian American movement in this country because up until then, I think, like people would be like, well, I'm Korean, I'm not Chinese, I'm Filipino, I'm not Japanese. But instead Asian Americans recognize that doesn't matter. You're going to get like hit on the head with a baseball bat first and then maybe ask questions later, which doesn't matter. And we're kind of seeing that again now. And so I think it's really important. I mean, in the midst of tragedy and like the tragedies that we're seeing with all of the Asian American anti-Asian violence, um, that that it is also a time for all of us and not just Asian Americans but our allies to stand up. But we've also learned that it is a time for Asian Americans also to stand up with Black Lives Matter and to really understand that when something happens, like George Floyd, I think really taught us that it's not just about just standing up when things happen to our community, but that we need to be in solidarity in a multiracial way. So it's been a time of a complicated, but also like a really, I think, affirmative time for Asian American community, and this is also some of the work that we're seeing in with our community foundation. That it is really a moment that shouldn't just be a moment that passes and then we go back to where things were, but to really think of it as as a movement. And I think just finally, what I've been really learning a lot too is that people like there are actually deep history, not only of the anti-Asian racism that people may not know about, but also of solidarity, of Black Asian solidarity. I just was learned that the 14th Amendment that allowed slaves to claim citizenship, African Americans to be citizens, that Frederick Douglass spoke up and said, well, that's got to apply to Chinese too, when Chinese were denied citizenship. That these were important voices that spoke up together, and that we need to be standing together in in terms of sustained change.
And in talking about change, and this is something that I think really is going to be crucial to our recovery, is helping companies to understand that it's not enough to say, okay, get along well in the sandbox, everyone is equal. You may have to actually take what used to be called affirmative action steps, because in the past, Asian Americans have been overlooked for promotions because the cliche is that they don't make as much noise, there are certain things. So, what do you think it will take in order to really make progress in terms of increasing representation of Asian Americans in American businesses?
Yeah, I mean, not just in businesses, but I think just in society as in general. And, that I do feel that's true. That is a stereotype, that Asian Americans, that we are docile, that we keep our heads down, that we don't make a noise. And I feel like that is something that certainly this new generation is not, is really pushing back on that. And I think for all of us, I think we recognize that in the face um, of injustice, that we need to speak up. That when that was the lesson of Vincent Chin, that we needed to like speak up against racism and injustice. And I see actually that my journalist friend Tiwa Chang has joined this conversation as well, because I told him about it. And Tiwa is for many many years he's been a leading voice as a journalist for New Yorkers, and certainly for Asian Americans. I think Tiwa was actually there in Detroit during the whole Vincent Chin, uh, and so he knows a lot more about that than I do. But I think our there are certain narratives, right, and certain stereotypes of Asian Americans. We are the perpetual foreigners. My sons who are like third generation New Yorkers, and but they're still asked, where do you come from? Where do you really, where do you come? And it might seem like an innocent question, but and they say, oh, I'm from New York, or I'm an Upper West Sider, but people are like, where do you really come from? And we know what they're asking. And it is that underlying it is that idea of like, you don't belong here, and of this perpetual foreigner um, stereotype. And then the other, as I alluded to, is this model minority stereotype, which is often weaponized to create a wedge, between communities of color. And so that we can be sort of like, well, all the Asians are doing so well, then what about other communities? Like, the problem must be with you and not with systems, which is not a good place for Asians to be dangling, this way. And so I do think that is what we're really learning about why it's important to be in solidarity with other communities of color, and for allies to really, stand up to that as well. So I feel like, whether it's in corporate culture, again, I think a lot of Asian Americans, we are seen as being really good worker bees, but not as leaders, as and in many ways, I know there's a lot of Wellesley women here. I think it's kind of a double whammy sometimes if you are also an Asian and you're also a woman, because, as we know, like women face a lot of those kinds of barriers as well. But then when you have that additional stereotype of being submissive, of being, I mean, so I think that was something that really came to light a few months ago in March when we had the shootings in Atlanta, and of the and the 6 out of 8 victims in the massage parlor, the spa shootings in Atlanta, they were women of Asian descent. And there was and there was so much like questioning of the shooter, like what was your intent, and is this a hate crime, or was it racism? And you know what, we know that it's not up to him to, like he was like, it's not up to him. I mean, we know from our work in the Korean American community here in New York. I mean, we're not in Atlanta, but we know that these women who were gunned down in their workplace were killed because of intersections of multiple vulnerabilities of race, of misogyny, of sexism, and poverty. And because if you don't have a lot of opportunities, for like of how to make a living, and then those are the this these women were very vulnerable, because of that. And I think um, it was really interesting in the coverage of the shootings. It became, these women were largely very invisible in America. They were like completely marginalized and voiceless. And suddenly, they were just because of this horrific um, crime, they became so visible. But those women, um, those vulnerable immigrants with lack of opportunities, they're very visible to us at our community foundation. Those are the people that we have been working long term to uplift. And so when we talk about anti-Asian hate, I think it's not just something that's happening overnight, suddenly happened. And I think what I'm trying to say is that it is deeply embedded in racist history in this country. It's deeply embedded in stereotypes that are harmful, and it's deeply embedded in lack of opportunities for, you know, for jobs that have dignity, or that allow mobility. Because when you have, like, when you face multiple barriers of language and of just skills and of even just inclusion, to be full participants in this country, then you are going to, you're incredibly vulnerable, but you're also very invisible to getting help.
So I have just one further question, and then I'm going to open it up for just a group discussion. So what's on your planning for the next year? We have a new president. We're going to have a new mayor. Anyone, please mute your line. What are your goals for the coming year?
So actually for us, I mean, the Korean American Community Foundation, 2022 is leading into our 20th anniversary, and it's been a time for really reflecting a lot on on our past 20 years, but also on the future. And I'm sure, for your foundation as well. I mean, as you kind of think through, you can do a lot of programs, or you can do a lot of different investments, and they all do some good. But if you look deeply, like there will be some of your work will have more impact or returns, however you measure that, than others. And so for us, I think one of the things that we really recognized was that money is really important. Like, funding is important. But we saw that actually those kinds of things that I'm alluding to, right? The kind of, like, how do you uh, um, uh, uplift, right? Like visibility, voice, dignity, these kinds of uh, things that keep people down. Um, One of the things that we see are the important role of grassroots nonprofit organizations that are often the first um, social kind of safety net for very vulnerable immigrants, that meet them where they're at in terms of with cultural understanding, um, with with language, and that build because things like um, relationships, right? And trust. I mean, those don't happen overnight. So a good example is like there, there's a lot of talk right now about anti-Asian, violence. And we want to make sure that they're tracked as hate crimes. If they indeed are hate crimes, and we want victims to report. But if it's all about just like more police tracking, to we're it's going to be very limited, like I think in order to get people to report, we really have to be working through the relationships that they trust in their communities, right? And so, I mean, and another good example was at the height of COVID, we have one of our grantee partners is the Korean Community Services in Queens. And they basically do a lot of like meals programs and senior services and a place for Korean senior citizens to, congregate and socialize. But of course, when COVID hit, like all the seniors, like they had to stay home, like they were really, and so then the Korean Community Services, like they started delivering meals. So that was one way to pivot. But the other thing that they did with a lot of their staff who were bilingual, bicultural, but suddenly didn't have seniors to like run dance programs or whatever with our funding, KCS trained them immediately around how to fill out an unemployment application, how to fill out a PPP for small businesses. You and I know, we all speak English well. Those things are really, really like hard to understand and navigate, even for if you're fluent in English. And so instead, like we were able to, people just came with their forms, with their masks, and they got like their hands held, and then they got, so with that help, 2,000 very low income small business owners and newly unemployed, um, Queens residents, got unemployment benefits and PPPs because, and KCS had never done this kind of work. They're just seen as a social service organization, but they were able to do that because that was the place where people in the community trusted to come. So I think we really need to understand that solutions often are not straightforward and that it's really complicated or complex, but to be able to be agile, in that way. So that's been a real lesson for us. And this is the kinds of things that we're doubling down on as well.
And how about kind of, you talked about the intersectionality of, like Black Lives Matter, and what about partnering with like other Asian groups? Is that also something that you're developing? Is that important to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's already there because I think, we are the Korean American Community Foundation. And so clearly, if we want to do like, Korean hot lunches for Korea, and we do that, but we want to get beyond just putting band-aids on like food insecurity and really get to like what are sort of like what is causing food insecurity, right? And then we want to be investing in advocacy, in organizing communities. It's not just advocacy is not just for Koreans or even just for Asian Americans. It is actually, like shifting policy, right? And so as a foundation, we invest in very direct services, but also in education, kind of like, so taking the food analogy, like, right, we might fund the food pantry, but we also fund in teaching people how to fish, right? Like, and in terms of like workforce development, job training, ESL, English as a second language. And then third part, on a very macro level, we fund around advocacy and community organizing as a strategy for change, so that it's not just about putting band-aids on problems, but really looking at systems change work. So all of those strategies mean that we cannot be just about Korean Americans. So we, as I said, we are the largest funder of Asian American nonprofits in the greater New York area right now. A good example is we fund the Asian American Federation of New York, and with our funding, they published the only research report that chronicles like the impact of COVID on job losses and unemployment in the Asian American community. And what you may not know, but if you think about it, Asian American New Yorkers are like totally over-indexed in jobs that were really disproportionately hurt by the pandemic, right? Around food services, around around dry cleaners or nail salons. I mean, all the things that were shut down, that you need to have interaction with somebody, versus many of us who just were able to pivot to like working remotely from home and working on a computer. Asian Americans were disproportionately impacted. And so we were able to fund that research, and that was disaggregated. So it was not only just Asian Americans, but it actually was like Bangladeshis were this, Koreans were this, like the Cambodian community, the Chinese community, Indian. And then with that research, we were able to go to New York State, New York City, and we were actually able to advocate for greater relief for Asian American communities. So we're involved on many, many levels.
It's so good to hear, because data can be very powerful. Armed with information, you can really advocate, I think, much more effectively. Are there any questions from our community today? Well, I guess it's kind of late in the Thursday, and we really, I think, covered so much. And of course, Kyung, as I said, I would look forward to you being a thought leader as we have our summer program. Any thoughts? Is there anyone I've missed?
I have a question.
Okay. Marianne, yes.
First of all, I'm really impressed with your thinking and everything that you've been doing. I'm really glad I tuned in, because it's very inspirational. So thank you for all the great work you're doing, and the thinking around it is really important. My question is, since I'm an artist and I work with other artists around issues, what role you see as artists, or if you've ever worked with artists or engaged artists in any of the social concerns, and if you haven't, how you might like to work with artists, or if that's something that would even interest you, because a lot of my work is around social issues in the public sphere. And I'm currently, and I'm working this summer in Chinatown in Chicago, in a 10-foot by 10-foot open cube. And I'm working with a Chinese filmmaker, a well-known Chinese filmmaker who's wonderful. And we're going to be setting the cube up like a living room and having conversations in Chinatown. And, any ideas that you have about how to engage the Chinatown community, or what, anything that sort of bounces off your head would be kind of interesting to me, because, yeah.
Yeah. So I have to say, for my foundation, just because we couldn't be like all things to all people, like we had to, so several years ago, we actually did like an impact strategy kind of study, and because there was a lot of conversation at the time about taking our foundation national, and as well as like what are the issues that we're going to fund. And so we really like focused on the greater New York area and also around economic security. So economic security being our North Star, it really, our funding is very much focused around, health, uh, jobs, and I would say like health, we really recognize as physical health, but also mental health, around workforce development, around housing. So it's still very broad because we know like what are the pieces that you need to go from being unstable, economically unstable and insecure to a place of self-sufficiency. Arts are a little bit outside of that, and so we have not been funding, in the arts space. But we really recognize that, that narrative and the importance of narrative change that arts and culture represent. It is, super important. And I think there are also a lot of foundations that recognize that and have that as their, as their priority. I think that we are seeing, I mean, again, for Asian Americans, we are seeing a time of real change. I think, where like in media and arts and culture, where Asian Americans were really invisible and not driving any narratives. But I mean, I think, as much as Crazy Rich Asians, a lot of people said like, well, that doesn't represent me, but that was important that it was a box office hit and that it was an all Asian cast, that we're seeing, that ever since then, that there is, more and more opportunities. And I think that is something that is going to, hopefully be growing and sustained. I think that, so we talked about Vincent Chin, this story, right? And there was a documentary about the injustice of that was done, in the late 1980s, and it was directed by two friends of mine, Renee Tajima and Christine Choi. They were nominated for an Academy Award, in the late 80s, and that's important. But I think what's really important now is that there's a lot of energy and interest in making a feature film about it. And I say that because when you think about a movie like Schindler's List, and the kind of box office and the awards and the kind of like that kind of film did more to shape and move attitudes and understanding and education about the Holocaust than any documentary, I believe. I remember when I first started as a reporter, I covered the Central Park jogger incident. I mean, and there's been a lot of news coverage of it, but I think this movie that was done, last year or the year before, like that did more to kind of make people understand and kind of shift attitudes about like what were some of the inherent racist barriers that these, that the accused faced. I feel this is the time that culture, like that popular culture, whether it's around arts or media, it has so much power, and especially as people are, partaking in various media. I think, and I think that it isn't just for the sake of, beauty, right? I mean, it can be, but it can be around shaping attitudes, pushing back on certain narratives, and also to be able to move us towards justice and to have, important messages. And I think, this is definitely a time to really explore and align with arts and social justice.
Thanks.
Okay, I had a question. First of all, congratulations, Kyung, on your achievement in founding this organization. I think it is remarkable, and I'm very impressed by the work that you do. And I've learned a lot listening to you today. My question is, I'm joining from California, and we have an enormous Asian population here. I was wondering if you have worked with any counterparts or had contact with any organizations on the West Coast in the Korean community.
Yeah, so actually, so we are here in New York, but and we're entering well, this is our 19th year, but about 7 years ago, we seeded a Korean American Community Foundation in San Francisco. So there is a KACF in San Francisco that's doing a lot of the similar work around, cultivating philanthropy and then also funding nonprofit organizations in the Bay Area. And so that is actually when, Leslie, you're asking that question about like, what are some of the other sort of goals, or that, we are, I mean, we did have to make some decisions and choices, along the way about focusing on New York. But I think that as we're kind of visioning for the future, we are thinking about how this can be sort of a more national initiative, but not just for the Korean American community, but is this a model of building democratic, inclusive philanthropy to uplift our vulnerable neighbors and create more equity for other immigrant communities as well? Because we are the only ones that really are doing this work as a model. I mean, in terms of other immigrant communities that may have longer histories but have not been organizing around philanthropic infrastructure.
So to be continued. Dan, of course, is in San Francisco, so maybe we can, have tie-ins. It's nearing the 5 o'clock hour, and it is a beautiful evening here in New York. So I want to thank everyone so much for joining us today. Kyung, it's so good to see you, so good to hear what you're doing for the community. It's very inspirational, but I can see we're just at the beginning of this journey. It's very exciting, and I look forward to collaborating with you and, of course, seeing you in person. Now it's possible again. So have to plan something. And also to the group who's here, we'll be also doing some in-person events in the fall now that it's possible. So we'll combine different things. But thank you, Kyung, for starting the conversation. And well, thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Thank you for having me. It's been really wonderful to be able to see all of you. Thanks.
Yes, bye everyone. Be well.
Bye.